God bless you, Brian. Thank you so much.
There's water here too.
Good, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thank you all for coming tonight. And here's to the new auditorium here that we have. It's great to be back at Lansing Catholic High School. I was here on Wednesday. I was in this auditorium on Wednesday. I gave 7 lectures here on Wednesday. And I'm done. So I would like to start by taking any questions that you might have. What I'm going to do is just give you a brief introduction to Chesterton, because this is not an introductory talk on Chesterton. And if you need a more thorough introduction, I will happily direct you to my book table outside, where you can buy some books on Chesterton. And I'll tell you some more about that in a bit. But who was he, and why do I have a fanatical devotion to him? Chesterton he's the best writer of the 20th century. And if anybody disagrees, we could start by having a debate right now. If you want to offer a better writer from the 20th century, we can just switch the whole evening to a debate. The reason I think he's the best writer is because he wrote about everything, and he wrote about it well. And whatever genre he wrote in, he was a master of that genre. He wrote novels, and he wrote plays, and he wrote poetry, and he wrote books on history, and on theology, and on philosophy, and on politics, and on economics, and on literature, and on art, and biography, and anything else that I didn't mention. And he wrote about it with a total command, and also a way of making whatever he was writing about totally accessible, and would give you a new perspective, especially on the things that you thought you already knew. He wrote only 100 books. If he had lived longer, he would have written more. But his books represent only a fraction of what he wrote, because he was a journalist, and he wrote for the London newspapers, and he wrote at least 5,000 literary essays. And as I've pointed out to other audiences here in Michigan this week, I want you just to try to grasp the number 5,000 essays. And the best way to do it is simply to write an essay. And then tomorrow, write another essay. That's 2 essays. And if you just keep on writing an essay every day for the next 5,000 days, you will have written 5,000 essays. And that gives you a better idea. And that's, by the way, that's 15 years. Then you can start in on your detective stories about Father Brown, your novels, your plays, and that book on Thomas Aquinas that's been, burning a hole in your soul that you want to write. And Chesterton was just incredibly prolific. And you have to understand, almost every evening he spent the way I'm spending my evening. He was asked to give a talk somewhere. And his talks were never what he wrote about. It was always completely new material that he was talking about. One of the things I'm doing in my research with the American Chesterton Society is to track down newspaper accounts of the talks that he gave. And he gave, well over 2,000 talks, speeches. And those accounts of those talks, it's completely new material. It's not repetitious of the thousands of essays. And it helps to boggle the mind when you consider that. So Chesterton, I call him a complete thinker. I also call him the apostle of common sense. And that is one of his great strong points, is common sense in a world that is remarkably void of common sense and really seems to thrive on uncommon nonsense. But a complete thinker, someone who really is able to think about everything and offer a complete and cohesive philosophy when he talks, so that whatever subject he's talking about, it's connected and consistent with everything else he's talking about. You can't catch him in a contradiction because it's all coming from an amazingly well-developed idea. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit tonight. So yeah, best writer of the 20th century. Especially because when he wrote just one sentence, it's a better sentence than just about anybody else wrote. Things like the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried. Or the Bible tells us to love our neighbors and to love our enemies, generally because they're the same person. Or men will not dispute about what they consider evil. They'll dispute about which evils they consider excusable. Or it's distressing to contemplate how few politicians are hanged. A citizen cannot distinguish between a tax and a fine, except that a fine is generally much lighter. Or angels fly because they take themselves lightly. So Chesterton, best writer of the I mentioned that. Why is it that there's a guy like Dale Ahlquist who has to go around the country talking about how important Chesterton is? It seems a little silly, because everybody should know it already. Why is it that everybody doesn't know about him? Somebody has dropped the ball somewhere. And I can tell you who it is. It's the people in charge of education. Amen. The role of schools is to pass truth from one generation to the next, and to tell us about the great thinkers and the great writers, and to teach those great thinkers and great writers to the next generation. And that's why we study Shakespeare and Thomas Aquinas and Mark Twain. And there shouldn't be someone like me having to say, you need to teach Chesterton. Why aren't you teaching Chesterton? Why is it that Chesterton has been locked out of the academy? Well, the main reason, there's several main reasons. In fact, there's about 6 or 8 reasons. I'll give you the weak reasons first, and then I'll give you the strong reason. One of the main reasons he's not taught is because he doesn't fit in one department. And the problem with our educational system is that we have everything compartmentalized. And we've split things up into subject matter that is very tight and narrow and doesn't ever overlap. So that's what is being studied in one subject has nothing to do with what's being studied in another subject. And each is in its watertight compartment, and thus children are taught in fragments and they think in fragments. And you will hear them speak in fragments. And Chesterton, he's a little too philosophical and theological for the literature department, but he's way too literary for the philosophy department. And though he writes about things like economics and politics, he's too far beyond those narrow subjects that he doesn't fit into them. And so you have the great irony of the 300-pound writer who has fallen through the cracks. That's one problem. The other problem, of course, is that he does talk about God. And of course, you better not have that in the schools, because that might offend somebody. And you can't be teaching things that are offensive. You have to, what you teach has to be limited to things like perverse sex. You don't want to teach anything offensive. But it's not just that he talks about God. He talks about God in such a way that when you read what Chesterton says, you want to change your life. He's a dangerous writer. He's actually too dangerous to be taught, because he will make you think. And when you start thinking, you're always in danger of reaching a conclusion. And life-changing writers have been successfully kept out of the curriculum. Even though he is a giant of English literature and really a giant of Western philosophy who has earned his place in the curriculum, he's a little too dangerous and he has to be kept out. So that's why Dale Ahlquist exists, so that he can at least get someone to read Chesterton. And the more people that read Chesterton, the better for the world. I will tell you that in spite of having all the odds against him, Chesterton has the advantage over his adversaries. First of all, he's bigger than they are. I mean, this is the guy who said he could stand up on a bus and offer his seat to 3 women at one time. But he also created something bigger than himself, and that is his incredible literary output. And because he has a cohesive philosophy, those who are narrow thinkers just simply can't get past the thing he talks about that affects them. The socialists can't get past their socialism. The feminists can't get past their feminism. The evolutionists can't get past their cells. That was funny. The psychologists can't get past their pasts. They're all comically defined by the one small thing that defines them. They're confined by the small thing that defines them. And they're stuck, as Chesterton says, in the clean, well-lit prison of one idea. And the categories that are too small to hold Chesterton are only big enough to hold them. And that's why he's not taught. And there's no place to put him. And our compartmentalized way of thinking can't accommodate him. But he deserves it. His poem, Lepanto, is one of the most shining accomplishments of rhyme and meter in 20th century poetry. His Ballad of the White Horse is the last great epic poem in English literature. Orthodoxy is a masterpiece of rhetoric and sustained argument and utterly original Christian apologetics. Everlasting Man is the most densely packed counterpoint to all the modern theories of science, mythology, history, philosophy, and religion. His novels are indeed novel. There's no other works of fiction to compare with The Man Who Was Thursday, or the Napoleon of Notting Hill, or The Ball on the Cross, or Man Alive, which has one of the best characters in modern fiction, a character named Innocent Smith, who is someone who is accused of attempted murder and multiple adultery and breaking and entry and abandonment, and he is guilty of all of them except that he's innocent. How does that work? I'm not going to tell you. His essays are all just perfect pearls that you can hear them drop on the glass-topped coffee table. What I found in my pocket, where he goes through the history of civilization by looking at each of the things that he finds in his pocket. How the railway ticket represents printing, and the pocket knife represents the sword, and the book of matches represents fire. And everything he finds is entertaining and profound. The one thing he can't find is his railroad ticket. On Lying in Bed, where he says one of the best things about, the only disadvantage of lying in bed, he says, is that you don't have a colored pencil long enough to reach the ceiling. Or the advantages of having one leg, one of his essays, after he sprained his foot. And he said, the way to love anything is to realize it might be lost. His literary criticism is the best. His book on Charles Dickens is dazzling. And you can love it even if you've never read a word of Dickens. You'd be swept away by it. Jesus in the Gospels says, "Blessed is he who takes no offense at me." And Chesterton is one who you are blessed if you take no offense at him. And he shouldn't offend you. But he is dangerous. He shouldn't offend you because he is writing with love and with great compassion and with a sense of joy and wonder and gratitude. And there's something attractive about him. But the problem is he speaks the truth. And truth is divisive. Truth acts like a sword. But Chesterton says a soldier fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him. He's defending the truth. And his intellectual attacks are because he loves what's behind him. But the thing is, he's a complete thinker because he knows how to think. And we don't like thinkers because we don't know how to think. And we've lost that simple skill. People get nervous when they hear the word philosophy because they think it's something that only philosophers do. But philosophy is something that everybody should do. In fact, it's too important to be left to philosophers. And the reason why most people avoid philosophy is because it involves thinking. And the reason why most people don't think is because thinking is hard work. Thinking, says Chesterton, is the hardest work in the world. It is the most repugnant to our nature. We are lazy, especially men. We'd love to have someone else do our work for us, even to do our thinking for us. And one of the reasons that it's hard to think is that it's hard to talk. It's hard work to put our thoughts into actual words. And even when we put language to work, we find that language is always falling short of its goal, falling short of what we want it to do. Chesterton says we are struggling in a fallen language like men struggling in the folds of a fallen tent. Great image. But it seems as if language continues to fall. In fact, it's hard to imagine how much lower it can fall. We seem to be getting more and more inarticulate. The result is that we try to say more and more with fewer and fewer words. Our young people have taken this form of minimalist language to its minimum. Their entire vocabulary consists of like, you know, and if they want to go multi-syllabolic, whatever. Think about that for a minute. Like, you know. Whatever is actually the most articulate of those, because it's sort of the postmodern word. It means I'm not going to think about this. But what do those other words mean? Like, you know. Well, like indicates a lack of precision. It means only an approximation, a vague similarity. They cannot say what is, only what it is like. They cannot even say. Like has replaced say. So he's looking at me like, why are you looking at me? And like, I'm not looking at you. And like you are, like, you know, like, whatever. And you know, what does you know mean? It means, I don't know. It means I hope you know, because I don't know. I don't know what, I don't know how to even say what I don't know how to say, you know? And what does mean? Is probably the most articulate of their inarticulate sounds, because it kind of sums up everything else that's missing from their mind. It's just a sound that's utterly meaningless. And yet it takes up the greater part of their speech, but why is it they can't talk? Because they can't think. And why can't they think? Because there are no words to correspond to the thoughts. And they haven't been able to think because we haven't taught them how to think. We've robbed them of that great gift of thinking. We've robbed them of the gift of language by not teaching them the beauty of language, by even the basics of grammar, so that they can construct a beautiful sentence with beautiful meaning. We haven't given them the tools. And of course, they're frustrated by their inability to be articulate and to put their thoughts into words. They can't even get at their thoughts. And so they're angry, they're frustrated, they're depressed. And they're tortured by that emptiness and that vagueness and that fogginess. And of course they're going to be attached to a machine, so just the images fill their brain because they don't have words working in their brains. And they become passive rather than active by creating words and having an actual conversation. Of course they're frustrated. And they're going to just fill their minds with whatever they can to cover and dull the pain. They'll do it with loud pounding music that fills their head with sound instead of words. They'll do it with loveless sex that fills their souls with something like affection. And ultimately, tragically, something even worse. They'll give up altogether. They'll go to complete darkness. To suicide, but on the way, they'll kill their own children. Yeah, thinking is important. Chesterton says if we think wrong, we'll go wrong. Thinking should be taught. G.K. Chesterton says, if people must not be taught religion, they must at least be taught reason, philosophy. If the state must not teach them how to pray, it can at least teach them how to think. And when I say that children should be taught to think, I do not mean, like many moderns, that they should be taught to doubt. For the two processes are not only not the same, but they are opposite. To doubt is only to destroy. To think is to create. Thinking should be taught. And Chesterton says, it used to be taught. It used to be taught in our schools. And it could be taught very easily in its just basic rudiments. Most thinking, Chesterton points out, consists in just 3 elementary maxims. 1, that all proof begins with something that cannot be proved, but can only be perceived and accepted. It's called an axiom, or a first principle. Now, first slide. There's no slides, don't worry. I'm going to repeat these things, because we're not going to rely on visuals. You have to look at me. It's the only time anybody ever does. The second one, there could be no argument except between those who accept the same first principle. And 3, an act can only be judged by defining its object. I'm going to repeat them. Why am I going to repeat them? So you will remember them. As I've told a couple other audiences this week, if you want anybody to remember anything in an audience, you have to repeat it 3 times. Because the first time you say it, they'll go, oh, that's interesting. But the second time you say it, they'll go, I've heard this somewhere before. And then the third time you say it, they'll go, you know, this guy is smart. He thinks the same way I do. Number 1, all proof begins with something that cannot be proved, but can only be perceived or accepted. It's called an axiom, or a first principle. 2, there can be no argument unless it is between those who accept the same first principle. And 3, an act can only be judged by defining its object. Now let's take them one at a time. The first one, all proof begins with something that cannot be proved, but can only be perceived or accepted. It's called an axiom, or a first principle. You start with a first principle. You start with an assumption. Chesterton says you cannot prove your first statement because then it wouldn't be your first statement. Faith precedes all argument. Faith comes before reason. Even in math, you start with something you can't prove. That's an act of faith. Faith precedes reason. You can build a great logical system only on an axiom that you can't prove, that you have to accept on faith. You can be the greatest mathematician in the world. You can be an agnostic, an atheist, a materialist, but you're still operating on faith when you start your logical proof. It starts with faith. It starts with an axiom. Euclid cannot prove one proposition, says Chesterton, without getting us to agree with his assumptions. Can't prove your assumptions, you can only assume them, but you can't reason without them. Father Brown, the detective, says only a man who knows nothing of reason talks of reasoning without strong, undisputed first principles. So, what are our first principles? Here's one. This is the one that saved Chesterton's life. When he was a young man, he was descending into depression. He had such a great mind that was firing on all cylinders. Probably also on all syllables. And he was in a dark place. And he was brought to the edge of the abyss. And he was considering ending it all. The demons recognized they had a prize in G.K. Chesterton. And they tried to pull him into the pit. And he said he was saved by clinging to one thin thread of thanks. And he started by saying, existence is better than non-existence. And he says you can build a very good philosophical system with that as your first principle. Existence is better than non-existence. You can save yourself a lot of bad thinking when you start with that axiom. Then once you have your first principle, you cannot have an argument with anyone else unless you share the same first principles. You cannot have an argument unless you have some common ground. G.K. Chesterton could debate with anybody. And he did, with people who violently disagreed with him, except he always charmed them and became friends with his enemies. Because the purpose of the battle, of the argument, is not to defeat your opponent, it's to convert your opponent. To get your opponent to betray his side and come to your side. But there was one person he would not debate. And that was a Satanist. It was Aleister Crowley. And Aleister Crowley crowed because of the fact that Chesterton refused to debate him. But it also drove him crazy that Chesterton was a happy man and he was miserable, even though he tried everything, every form of pleasure and perversity that could be imagined, and he was a miserable man. But Chesterton said he had no common ground. There was no place to even start the argument with Aleister Crowley. So if you can't get people to agree on first principles, especially on the principle that existence is better than non-existence, you really can't hold a conversation. Chesterton, of course, was famous for carrying around a gun. They conceal and carry. And when someone said that life was not worth living, he would pull out the gun and offer to shoot the person. Number 3, an act can only be judged by defining its object. One of the reasons that we do not know how to think is that we cannot define the object of our acts. Here are 3 words that you always hear: progress, success, efficiency. Those words are utterly meaningless unless we define what it is we are progressing towards, what it is we are successful at, and what we are efficient at, with. Choose your preposition. But you can't make progress your goal, you can't make success your goal, and you can't make efficiency your goal. Those are not goals. Progress isn't the goal, it just simply means going on towards going on. Chesterton says the whole of modern civilization does not know what it's trying to find, and therefore it does not find it. The only true object of existence is to mean something, says Chesterton. And when people say, well, I believe in progress, you have to say, progress towards what? What is your goal? Then we can figure out whether or not you are progressing towards it. Progress is a comparative of which we have not determined the superlative. All through history, says Chesterton, there have been broad conceptions of the aims of life, tests of morality, which masses of men have held and applied with certainty. But in the modern world, these various systems have been abandoned, and what is left of them is nothing but debris, a collection of broken bits, the ruins of past philosophies. There are some like myself who hold a mystical philosophy, a belief that behind human experience there are realities, powers of good and evil, and the final test for things is their influence for good or evil. The good power intends us to be happy, and we are justified by being happy. But the real question is not whether we are happy, but whether behind the things wherein we seek our happiness lies the power of good. Everybody wants happiness, but can we be happy with evil? Happiness is not the test, goodness is. But Chesterton makes the case that if you are good, you will be happy. You will also be put to the test. Just as all thinking begins with faith, faith will always be put to the test. It ends with faith as well. We are at the Lumen Veritatis lectures, the light of truth. G.K. Chesterton says, we are children of light, and yet we sit in the darkness. We have the greatest tools in all of history available to us, and we don't use them. We have the greatest truth in the universe, and we ignore it. There's all other truths. There's one truth to which everything else is relevant, and that is the Incarnation. And if we try to do anything that is not connected to that, it will end in irrelevancy and madness. And G.K. Chesterton knew, as he said, that all subjects are really one subject. There's only one subject, and nothing is irrelevant to that subject. You are always talking about God. Whether you're talking about pigs or binomial theory, you're talking about God. And things can be irrelevant to the proposition that Christianity is not true. But nothing is irrelevant to the idea that Christianity is true. It's a truth that affects everything else. And the reason we don't know how to think is because we are trying to avoid that truth. And by avoiding it, it's destroying our civilization and our children. We need to just proclaim the truth, but we also need to teach the basics of reason and the fundamentals of how to think. And one of the best teachers that God has given us is G.K. Chesterton. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Are you willing to take some questions?
I will take questions. I will even attempt to give answers. Yes, you should join the American Chesterton Society. And let me tell you how to do that. We have a table out there. We do take checks, cash, or credit card. And it's a $49 membership for 1 year. And it's $119 for 3 years. You get Gilbert Magazine, which just happens to be the best magazine in the world. That would be reason enough to join, just that alone. But then you'd also get a 20% discount on our books, which would by itself be reason enough to join. But we're also offering you 2 free books of Chesterton's poetry that I'll send you. If for a 1-year membership, I'll send you 2 books in paperback, and for a 3-year, I'll send them to you in hardcover. And that's worth the value of the membership. No, because Chesterton wrote the poems, so obviously he didn't autograph them. And then the fourth reason you should join is because you're supporting the work of the Chesterton Society, and that includes helping get him canonized. All right. You get a prayer card too, that's free. All right, another question, yes?
So you spoke about teaching how to think. I think a lot of times what I've realized is that there's sort of a pipeline effect. So even if you're completely accepting of everything that you said about this particular author, but any other Catholic teaching, you might approach faculty at a high school or any school, and those teachers are also unbelievers, or so to speak, and they might even be in a Catholic school. So how do you front load this? How do you get this pipeline to start to engage? Because they'll kind of come back and say, well, yeah, I've heard of him, but we may not want to, we have this other novel we want to read. What's been your experience, at least?
Well, we just try to keep finding all the ways we can to sneak Chesterton into schools. In colleges and universities, the way it's been happening is by students wanting to do a thesis on Chesterton. And they usually can't find a professor who knows anything about Chesterton, but the professor says, well, sure, yeah, you could do that, I guess. and so I'm seeing more senior theses from students, but also master's theses now and dissertations as well. So it's a grassroots effort, and it's not a top-down thing now. I can tell you a story I just heard this week that was kind of horrifying, that a high school student wanted to do a project on Chesterton, and the teacher determined that he was a white supremacist and would not be able to do it. And I'm not quite sure where and how they came to that conclusion. In fact, I'm completely not sure how they came to that conclusion, but that's one way they've shut out thinking there. Public education basically is at the point of Carthage right now, and it must be destroyed. Yes?
What do you think of C.S. Lewis?
C.S. Lewis, I'm not familiar with the name. No. So I was a big C.S. Lewis fan in my time, and it was because I read C.S. Lewis I found my way to Chesterton. The book that changed C.S. Lewis's life was The Everlasting Man. He was an atheist when he read that book, and that's the book that brought him to Christianity. But he was very well read in Chesterton. And of course, when I was in college when I was reading C.S. Lewis, and someone said to me, if you like C.S. Lewis, you'll love Chesterton. And then he said the amazing thing. He said, in fact, if you read Chesterton, you don't even need to read C.S. Lewis, because all of C.S. Lewis is in Chesterton. And I thought that was blasphemy. But I kind of tucked it away, and then finally started reading Chesterton. And the more I read of Chesterton, the more I realized all of C.S. Lewis is in Chesterton. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just curious, do you think Chesterton would have kept good company with the Inklings?
Yeah, he would have. I mean, the Inklings loved Chesterton and would talk about his books all the time, but he didn't know them. He never met any of them. He was about 20 years older than they were. But of course he would have kept good company. While they smoked their pipes, he would have smoked his cigar. And they would have had wonderful discussions together. They were huge admirers of him, and they would use Chesterton in their arguments with each other. It's a kind of a common misconception that he was one of the Inklings, but he was not. Yes?
Just on that comparison, if you would, please share your impressions about why Lewis is almost universally acknowledged and Chesterton not, among evangelicals especially, but even among Catholics.
Well, first of all, the evangelicals have done a better job with Lewis than the Catholics have done with Chesterton. The other problem, of course, is that Lewis wrote a finite amount of material. And Chesterton is literally too big to get a hold of. And that's been, he's cumbersome in that sense. Lewis is a little more contained. And he's accessible because of that. The other thing is that Chesterton really did write about everything, and Lewis only wrote about a few things. So he's graspable. There's one other big point too about Lewis and Chester, why Lewis is better known, and I think part of it has to do with the fact that obviously Lewis didn't become Catholic, and we live in a Protestant country, and he's the Protestant guy. He's just a go-to guy for the evangelicals, and yet so many evangelicals who read C.S. Lewis find their way to the Catholic Church because they find their way to Chesterton or something else. He will get them thinking about a larger understanding of the faith than their own. And so C.S. Lewis has played just a huge role in Catholic conversions. And he obviously was the first step in my own conversion. And so when people ask, well, why didn't C.S. Lewis become Catholic? Well, he was on his way to becoming Catholic, but it was necessary that he didn't become Catholic because he made so many other Catholics as a result of him not being Catholic. Yes?
You mentioned Aleister Crowley. What was the connection between Chesterton and Crowley? Were they classmates, roommates, something like
No,
that?
they were both writers, and Crowley had written something and Chesterton wrote a response to it, or the other way around. And let's see, who wrote it for? Yeah. Chester was reviewing a book that Crowley wrote, and Crowley responded to that and then challenged him to a debate, and Chesterton didn't take it. He didn't take the challenge. Yes?
So distributism, or his ideas on economics and politics, where do you find it? Like which books?
Yeah, one of the books I'd recommend to get tonight, especially for this crowd, is The Complete Thinker. It's the third book I wrote. There's a chapter in there called How to Think, which some of the same material you heard tonight is in that. But there's also a one-chapter description of distributism in there. It's the best concise explanation of distributism you can find. If you want to go deeper, get The Hound of Distributism, which is also out there. But the chapter is called Buying and Selling in The Complete Thinker. And it explains the Chesterton's ideas on Catholic social thinking. Yes?
I have kind of two questions. One is, I've met a lot of great thinkers, or at least they said they were great thinkers. And Satan was a great thinker. But without the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, you can destroy people and civilizations. So how did the Holy Spirit and his prayer life, the sacraments, work into Chesterton's writings and works? And then kind of related to that, because we're talking about a bunch of British authors, I understand that public education had a influence from England, which was the Old Satan the Deluder Act, which was the first act for public education in England. And that kind of took the religious training away from the parents and the church and put it into the school system. So it could be tapped, and that came over to the United States and influences public education today. So how does the Holy Spirit work with his writing, and how come those writers never directly attacked or tried to overcome the old Satan, the Deluder Act in England, which has its negative implications in American education?
You said it was two questions, and that was more. I was counting, but that's okay. What was the question? How the Holy Spirit, yeah. So Chesterton clearly had a mystical connection to God. he had a way of seeing the truth that God blessed him with. When he writes on St. Francis of Assisi and St. Francis's mysticism, he is describing something that only an insider could describe. And so there's no question that Chesterton communed with the Holy Spirit. And his great gift of knowledge, of wisdom, and his ability to articulate the truth was a divine gift. And he used it for God's glory. And he was able to do that because he was hugely humble and he loved the truth. And he saw that the Incarnation is the truth that informs everything else. He says the mystic is the one who passes through a moment when there's nothing except God. And he also indicates in one of his little passages, he says, it's almost embarrassing to talk to God face to face as one talks to a friend. And obviously he had that experience. And he doesn't crow about it at all. It just kind of sneaks in there. And so his writing is driven by a love for God and a love for everyone else, the two great commandments. And there's only one way to describe it, is that it's filled with the Spirit. And that's why it's so good. And when you read Chesterton, you're drawn more than anything else to his goodness. Now, as for how public education has systematically screwed things up, the public education in this country is connected to the public education in Europe, but it was really through Germany that it happened. And Germany affected the English public education system, and then that came to the United States. And it really was as good intentioned as it could have been, but it was a Protestant system. And so it was flawed, and it was limited in its sense of truth, and it was going to start teaching error almost right away. And it started by simply trying to give a Protestant version of the truth to then giving basically a godless version of knowledge. And it just became more and more narrow. And when you're not, you're either telling the truth or you're telling a lie at a certain point. And we've just only been given fragments of fact with our public education system. And at a certain point, you're just getting falsehood. And it's just a slow, steady progress. And it was because there's no truth holding it together.
Well, this is just a statement. I was personally surprised because I graduated with a degree in government from Harvard, but I wanted to work as an elementary school teacher. So I went back. They changed the designation of time now. They call it, I don't know, common law or common era or something like that. I'm like,
Common era, the common eras, yeah.
Common to what?
Mm-hmm.
And then I saw that they were dismantling things. And then they actually, that's how I learned about this bill, the Old Satan, the Deluder Act, and they had it in the training of teachers, a reference to it. And that's what they called it. And it was so, see, I'm like in my 50s, but it's so dismantled from when I was young. And also they said none of my education would count, and I'd have to start over as though I was coming out of high school.
You were really happy for that Harvard degree you got at that point, weren't you? Well, it's again, by forcing state licensure of teachers, that's controlling education. Even if it's forcing non-public schools to have state licensure, and it's going to be an increasing war that we're going to be fighting. Accreditation is going to be a big battle. But the Catholic Church has got to start getting really organized on these things and be prepared to do battle.
I even saw in the teacher education tests, there was a religious test question that was in the test. And I knew that if I answered it the way they wanted me to, I would be denying God.
You have to tell a lie. Yeah, they're forcing you to tell a lie if you stand up for your faith. Okay, here's a question.
For someone who's new to Chesterton, what would you recommend within his books, like
Start with the book that I wrote called The Apostle of Common Sense, or Common Sense 101. Those are designed to introduce you to Chesterton. And even though I technically have my name on them as the author, all I do is quote Chesterton. It's the easiest way to write a book in the world. Just quote Chesterton. Yes, in the back there.
I'm also new to Chesterton.
So same answer.
But I'm wondering what he would tell someone like me. So, for example, I left the workforce when I became a mother at 31. Prior to that, I'd been practicing law. So I often wonder if I should be in the courtroom rather than changing diapers. I feel like, would I better serve our culture if I was out doing something more? What would you say to me?
Well, there's nothing wrong with the fact that you trained to be an advocate. Obviously, the greatest possible work you can do in this world is to be a mother. And when your child is raised, you have that law degree and you can put it to work again. And there's probably things you can do even from the home where you can still serve in some capacity. But right now, it's just a matter of your priorities, and God has put you in a gifted position to care for another human being and form that soul. Yes.
Last one. Which book would you recommend for atheists, the typical atheist who can't understand the world of suffering?
I have a book called All Roads, and it's called Roman Catholic Apologetics, Roman, R-O-A-M-I-N. And we kind of take on all the classic arguments, and I use, as my main source, Chesterton's arguments. Sometimes I'll use the Church Fathers, and when I'm desperate, I will use the Bible. Thank you, God bless.